What's up, everyone? I am making this video about Jordan Peterson and 12 Steps Narcotics Anonymous. I'm actually recording it in landscape mode. I gotta give a shout out to my friend Joe Dugan, who emailed me and said I can turn the phone the other way. Hey, we all have our strengths. So there's a lot that I could talk about in terms of Peterson and 12 Steps. When I first encountered Peterson, I swore that he was an AA guy. Upon further inquiry and exploration, I really think that just the 12 Steps and Peterson are both drawing on older, more practical types of wisdom that both run counter to some of our modernist and postmodernist ways of looking at the world. I've been able to pretty effectively, I think, weave a lot of the stuff that Peterson talks about into my practice of sponsoring people in my own utilization of the 12 steps in my life. Like I said, there's a lot that I could talk about, but just thinking off the top of my head right now, some of the things that I can think of right now involve the power of narrative. So in our modern world, we are often very, I would say, list-oriented and abstract. So often people will want to almost make a list of the things that are bothering them, what their issues are, and they make them general, and then from there they try to maybe apply fixes. So this is modernism quintessentially. This is the mechanistic worldview where human beings are like cars. I'm sitting in a car right now. The Ford dealership is right behind me. They're cars. There are flaws in the system. There's flaws in the way that the parts are logically interconnected, and that very well may be true. But what Peterson talks about is that when we're dealing with the human being, and you're dealing with the human being who has a really pretty complex history and then is engaging in a pretty complex world going forward, this is not a static phenomenon like a car. You can't do surgery on a life. You could do surgery on a body. You could even do surgery on the mind. But what you try to fix will be fixed. So human beings are dynamic. So they go forward into, and Buddhism is very instructive in this way, because Buddhism says that everything's temporary and everything's interconnected. So Buddhism has a sense of time and space that is much more honest, but also much more overwhelming. That space is vast, and then we exist in space, and then there's all these factors that kind of there's like a spider web of causation across space, and then in time everything is kind of like changing and falling apart, and sometimes falling together too. But if you put those two things together, you have a human being at the nexus of time and space. And so to simply just go into that person at the time and space and say, okay, here's your problem, we're going to fix this problem. Well, you may fix that problem but create another problem. Then there's, even if you get the abstract problem correct, there's the problem of implementation of the solution in the prescription. I mean, for decades there's been many abstract solutions to drug addiction, both chemical and behavioral, and they both fail way more often than they succeed. And it's not necessarily that they're wrong, it's just that they're not wrong in themselves. They're in some ways getting the conceptual framework wrong, and this is what Peterson comes in. So we live in narratives, and then we go out and live. So this idea of the hierarchy, and these two things are connected. So we tell stories. When we're telling stories, we are adjusting our hierarchy. So if somebody shares in a meeting and they start kind of just talking about what's going on in their life. So they're at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. If you're not familiar, there's a space where you kind of share about where you're at in your recovery. And a lot of times it really has nothing to do with drugs. It has to do with all the other factors that are part of the whole life, where drugs was a part and could be a part. So people are talking about what their life looks like in this moment, because if their life looks a certain way, it's going to be more likely that they're going to use drugs. So as they're outlining it, they're dealing with lots of different things and lots of different factors. And so people may talk about the relationships, talk about work, they may talk about their social interactions, they may talk about their feelings, they may talk about trauma, they may talk about fear of the future. And as they do that, they're engaging with this, what I said was a nexus of time and space, that there is so many different things that they could choose to talk about. But what they do is they refine that. So they start off and they start like outlining what is important to them. And through that outlining, the narrative outline, they actually get closer to what is most important. But they don't get it 100% right, and they can't necessarily rate it effectively. They get a sense of it, and then maybe they go and practice it. So somebody will share and they'll talk about, my job is really what's bothering me today. And as they talk about it, like, well, what really is bothering me? Well, I'm afraid I've never really been a professional person. And that's actually borrowed from my experience. So, well, what is it about being a professional person that bothers you? And it's not even as if somebody might ask them. After the meeting, someone might ask that. And in the meetings, we don't give direct feedback, maybe afterwards. But as I would say, I was the one sharing, as I said that out loud, I would be refining. So I have a hierarchy of things going on in my life, and the job, I just place that in high importance. And then once I've established that, then I'm starting to drill down deeper into make a hierarchy of that part of the hierarchy. So what is it about the job? So what is the thing that's at the top of the pyramid of needs in that specific domain? So the job is the top of the pyramid of needs. And then within the domain of the job, what is it about the job? And it's like, well, fear. Well, fear of what? Well, fear of being a professional. Okay, well, so we're starting to get to some level of specificity. And then it'll be like, well, I don't know what a professional does. So I have certain communication styles that came from, just using me as an example, I'm very academic and I'm very good with words, but I also lived in, I hate saying it this way, but there's no other way to say it, the streets, so to speak. And there's working class suburbia, but at the same time, it was and then in the world the subsection of that world, it was the street. It was in some ways tough. Not the toughest place in the world, not the toughest place in America, but it was tough. And then it was tough for someone like me who was a little more sensitive, a little more intellectual. But I have that way that I learned over time to deal with other human beings. And so just in the space of talking about it, I've drilled down into a level of specificity. But here's where it gets even more complex. And one of the things they say in the program is it's a simple program. And no, I think the idea that we what we're told to do, and this is funny because this is a hierarchy of needs too, is that we're told to stay abstinent. We call it stay clean first, and then there's some other things we do, and there's rituals and there's practices, and sharing is one of those practices. That conceptual framework is simple, but the actual application is not. So we're at a level of complexity that needs to be simplified. So maybe when they're saying that it's a simple program, is that simplicity is achievable, but what I'm arguing is the path to simplicity is not simple. It's complex, or the factors that are involved in complex. So I've gotten down, so in the space of utilizing a certain practice of the 12 steps and sharing a narrative thing that Peterson would talk about, and then I've engaged in this kind of salience seeking. So salience is similar to relevance. What is important? This hierarchy. What is the most important thing? I've identified that without even realizing it. And then I've gotten to a level of specificity that gets down to, for me in a professional environment, I struggle with communicating with people because it runs counter to my experiences living in a working class neighborhood, being an academic person, both being academic and sensitive, but also being a defensive person because I was taught to have certain defenses, that there's bits of both of them that can be taken and applied to an office professional environment, but just by themselves, they're challenges. There's like a third way, like a synthesis of the two practices. So I've identified what the problem is, then what is the solution? And so if I identify certain solutions, it's like, well, what I identified over time was slow down, ask questions, think before I speak. One of the things I do is pray and meditate, which is essentially the means by which I slow down. Because if I am praying, I'm believing implicitly that things are going to be okay. That calms my nervous system. And then it makes it more likely for me to be optimistic enough to try a new path. But also there's a humility there because I'm admitting that I am in need of guidance from a higher thing or phenomenon. And that allows me to be open enough to actually attempt the new way of doing things. So the new way of doing things was, okay, if I start to feel like I'm going to go street on somebody, I need to maybe fall back a little bit to use street language, like slow down, slow your roll. If I'm going to get too academic and intellectual, I need to like maybe try to be more concise, because you don't always want that in an office environment when you're just trying to complete tasks. You don't need an intellectual rundown of why you send this email. And then I go practice it and then say it fails, because it's failed many times. Then I go back to a meeting or talk to somebody else, and then I'm constantly refining. So it's not as simple as being like, Joel has work problem. Okay, go fix work problem. The nature of the problem, when we abstractly label these things, the abstraction is an extreme oversimplification of a vastly complex world that is multidimensional, multi-causal, multi-factor, and then it's dynamic, it's ongoing. So you have these I don't know what the plural of nexus is, nexuses. It's like there's 5 billion of us, and we are all these overwhelmingly leveraged and multidimensional creatures existing in time and space that is vast. And it's like you could blow your mind like thinking about all the different how complex it actually is. So we're like going and we're bouncing off other people, and energies and different things are happening, and we're having experiences and we're reacting, and we're all reacting slightly different to experiences, and we can't pack them all. And Peterson talks about this. We can't pack them all into our brain. We have to actually, our brain, our survival mechanism actually does it for us many times. That's why we have blind spots. That's where it's like, they talk about denial in the 12-step programs. Denial's not a sophisticated enough world. We have blind spots because we've been set up to survive in certain ways. So we may not even see. So our hierarchy can be oriented towards a certain goal, but as time goes on and things change, the hierarchy has to be reorganized. And so that takes this process of through narrative and then through like actual embodied action. So we go out and we actually experience things. We practice new ways. Don't get me wrong, the labeling, the abstract labeling is part of it, but it's what you would say is something that's necessary but not sufficient. It's not enough. Some people get anti-intellectual and say, well, you don't need to think, and they used to tell me I think too much or whatever. And if I was only thinking, they were right, but they were wrong, because it's not, the problem isn't thinking, it's the problem is only thinking. Thinking is tremendously important. As I'm talking, I'm thinking out loud. But what Peterson talks about is narrative and then hierarchies, and he puts them together. And through this is why people can't necessarily often can't stay abstinent or stay clean on their own, because they're actually having to reorganize the phenomenon of a being. Their being in time. Heidegger talks about this, that in some ways, and people have made parallels between Heidegger and Buddhism, that we are becoming. We're not even beings, because that implies that we're these discrete, like more or less static creatures. And it's funny because the word creature, in a sense, is like the created. A creator makes a creature. In reality, we're creators and created at the same time. So we're constantly putting stuff out into the universe. It's changing things, and then we're being, in turn, affected by it. And the numbers of ways that's happening are almost infinite. But as we participate in that and are able to step back from it and use our mind and our thinking to label it, that's where the hierarchy comes in. And that's where we do this through telling stories. And telling stories, we actually are doing the salience seeking, or the salience finding. So as we're telling a story, the natural way that stories are structured, that Peterson would argue actually goes back millions of years genetically and physiologically, it actually helps us find the salience. So we can just almost jump into a story. So it's like we go to a meeting, we tell our story, and suddenly we're finding useful truths. Not the capital T truth, but useful truths on the ground level. Not saying there isn't an absolute truth, it's just saying accessing it as a human being is incredibly difficult. So we're navigating and going through this and finding truths through narrative. And in the truths, some truths are more important than others. They're more higher on the hierarchy. And once we establish a hierarchy, that guides action. I talked about working in a professional environment. That is the corporate structure, that's the hierarchical business structure, even government structure. That's institutional structures in many ways are that, because that matches the same thing that we do as humans. It's like, well, some things are more important than others. So we administrate. So it's almost like we're creating corporate structure to our lives. We're the executive, but then we delegate different things to different parts of ourselves. And that is exactly what is recovery through the 12-step process. And the thing about it is 12 steps don't have a monopoly on this. You can do this. It's just my argument has always been that I don't know if somebody can do it in isolation. If they cobble together people and they're engaging in the same thing, they could do it. But that's not what normally. So if you're surrounded by people that don't have, or they don't think they have problems, and you just start like sharing about your problems, they're going to be like, well, I don't want to talk about that. Or, go talk to a professional. So people get isolated in their problems and they fall into the patterns of other people. So in the 12 steps, it just happened to be, and it didn't happen to be, it was designed this way because it worked. I don't know if people were as aware of it, but we have this structure set up where we talk about our issues, both in a group level when we're in the meetings, and then one-on-one with the people that care about us, and then particularly a sponsor who's kind of a guide. And we're engaging in this truth seeking, this setting this hierarchy of engaging in this hierarchical formulation of what our problems and solutions are. And we're using narratives to do it. And then we're engaging in actual real stories as we go live. And then we're reporting back, well, I went and did this, and this happened, and this happened. And then from that, we're like sorting through what's true or what's relevant, I should say. And that's giving us positive feedback loops into our becoming, into our being. So people report who are able to engage in this. People report having better lives, self-reported. So they talk about having success by whatever metric is defined. There's various ways you can define success, but it doesn't matter. People report it. They may have different metrics, and Peterson talks about this, comparing themselves to themselves. But regardless of the metric, they are self-reporting success. And I think it's because of this very process that the 12-step programs lay out for people. And it's exactly what Peterson talks about in terms of hierarchies and narratives. So that's just two aspects of his thinking that have impacted me as I actually help people in this process. And I'll allude to this stuff a lot, and I'll help people as they're like trying to define what their problems are. I try to help them figure out what's the most important thing. And I try to, I'll end with this. One of the most important things is to not feel bad if it's overwhelming, because it's overwhelming. And often people who, I'll say one of two things. People it doesn't seem overwhelming, maybe they're hiding how it's overwhelming, or they're in denial. There are three things. Or they're in denial about their problems, or they've already done the work at some point, or some combination of the three. So it's tremendously humanizing to be like, listen, this is not easy. And it's not, we don't want to say that it's too hard either, because that can be overwhelming to people, but it's challenging. It's a doable challenge, but it's a challenge to engage in this process of seeking useful truth in your world about yourself in ways that are going to prevent you from falling into what we call the chaos of active addiction, into that despair and hell and those behaviors that don't serve us. That's what we talk about. Like when we were using drugs or engaging in other negative behaviors, it no longer actually gave us a payoff. It's just all we knew how to do anymore. And this way of actually encountering the world and encountering meaning and encountering truth seeking actually prevents that from happening, and then actually creates structures to actually be what we call happy, joyous, and free, find meaning and purpose, and live a life that's worth living. So 20 minutes, not bad.